Recently, I was invited on the Ben Shapiro show to discuss Pope Francis and Catholic teaching on man's goodness, so I'll share that with you today. But before I do that, I want to give you an update. Because of everybody who joined our Patreon community this month at TrentHornPodcast.com, we're currently updating the studio to Phase 1, and it's going to look so much better for future episodes. Ideally, by the end of the summer, we'll be at Phase 2 and be able to do full interviews with brand new camera equipment. And if you want to help us to reach that goal, please become a supporter at TrentHornPodcast.com. If you do that before the end of May, you get a free copy of my new book, Confusion in the Kingdom: How Progressive Catholicism Brings Harm and Scandal to the Church. Second, when it comes to the interview, one thing I didn't mention was that I wish Pope Francis had not said we are fundamentally good.
What gives you hope?
Todo.
Everything.
Uno ve tragedias.
You see tragedies,
pero ve
but you also see so many beautiful
tantas
things.
cosas lindas. Uno ve madres heroicas.
You see heroic mothers,
Hombres heroicos.
heroic men.
Somos
We are all
fundamentalmente
fundamentally
buenos.
good.
Por ahí somos un poco
Yes, there are
pícaros,
some rogues and
pecadores,
sinners,
pero
but the
el
heart
corazón
itself
es bueno.
is good.
Even though I don't know if that's what he said, because other parts of the interview mistranslate what he says, like how Pope Francis said same-sex unions went against natural law, but that was mistranslated. Saying humans are fundamentally good can lead to the false idea that sin is incidental to humanity. You can say human beings are good because they're made in God's image, even though that image is corrupted by sin. You can also say human beings are evil because we have a nature that tends towards sin. The Bible uses both kinds of language to describe humanity. In the interview with Shapiro, I stressed that Catholics hold a balanced view that neither denies the universality of sin, nor does it say human beings are totally depraved. Some Christians have interpreted the doctrine of total depravity to mean the image of God is destroyed in man through original sin. John Calvin said sin canceled and effaced the image of God, and Martin Luther spoke of the loss of this image through sin. However, many other Protestants take a moderate view on the issue, and even Calvin seemed to moderate his view on the matter later in life. The Catholic Church recognizes that even as fallen creatures, human beings can use reason to know God exists. They can hear God's commands in their conscience, and they'll be judged on their response to those commands. And humans can freely accept or reject God's grace and gift of salvation. That's why Pope Francis says in Gaudete et Exsultate, only on the basis of God's gift, freely accepted and humbly received, can we cooperate by our own efforts in our progressive transformation. We must first belong to God, offering ourselves to Him who is there first, and entrusting to Him our abilities, our efforts, our struggle against evil, and our creativity, so that His free gift may grow and develop within us. And with that being said, here's what I said to Ben Shapiro on the matter.
So I've been talking a lot on the show today about a comment that Pope Francis made in his 60 Minutes interview that was, I think, somewhat confusing, where he suggested that human beings are good, that there are sinners, but human beings are good. And the way that I had sort of laid out this issue is that this is one of the differences possibly between Jewish and Catholic theology, is that in Judaism, human beings are not inherently good. Human beings have what's called the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov. They have a bad desire and a good desire. Those are at war with each other at all times, and it's your job to empower the good desire to overcome the bad desire. That in Catholicism, there is this idea from Aquinas that human beings are made in the image of God, and thus human nature does have inherent good to it, and that sin entered the world through original sin. But that doesn't mean that human beings and how they act today or in toto are good. Is that correct, or am I messing that up?
Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think we have to remember that, when Pope Francis is speaking in an interview, he's giving an off-the-cuff answer. And in theology, you can always qualify everything. Right before that answer in the 60 Minutes interview, he did say, we are all sinners, even I, we are all sinners, recognizing the universality of sin. So I think that when we look at it, there's going to be two extremes. So on the one extreme would be the modern idea from like Rousseau, like, oh, we're all good, all humans are good, it's society that makes us bad, which is totally bunk. But then the other extreme would be some Christian traditions that would say man is totally depraved, the image of God is destroyed in us. Catholics would say that the image of God is defaced by original sin, but it's not destroyed. And the word that we would use is concupiscence. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church puts it this way, that concupiscence is the movement of the sensitive appetite contrary to the operation of the human reason. St. Paul identifies it with the rebellion of the flesh against the spirit.
Concupiscence stems from the disobedience of the first sin. It unsettles man's moral faculties, and without being in itself an offense, inclines man to commit sin. So the bottom line is that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, but because of original sin, the image of God is defaced in us. And so we have an easier time doing evil than doing good. It's like when we have two paths, doing good is taking the uphill path, doing bad is taking the downhill path. And we are inclined to that, but we're not hopelessly depraved. We still have that light of goodness from God inside of us that we can look towards.
So one of the things that I was talking about on the show today is that the Rousseau vision can be seen in some way as a pretty deep perversion of Christian theology, that the attempt to suggest that, okay, human beings are made in the image of God, therefore humans are naturally good, and all sin is actually external to human beings created by systems. And that's what we're seeing today, and that is a complete perversion of biblical ideals and ideas, that if human beings are inherently good without capacity for sin, that sin is, in fact, sort of a foreign body to human beings and only created by the systems above them, which is, again, taken up by Rousseau, is taken up by Marx. This sort of idea has taken deep root in the West to the extent that there is a deep-seated belief that simply that, number one, all human beings think the same and act the same and are inherently good in the same ways. And therefore, if you just change the systems at the top of the institutions, then magically all human beings will sort of flower into Western ways of thinking. And that seems perverse to me.
Yes, it is perverse, and that's not the traditional understanding of the relationship between society and people. So the traditional view is that because people are born with an inclination to sin, it is society that's needed to make them good. So people are born bad, quote unquote, not totally bad, but with an inclination to sin. Born bad, society makes them good. The modern view inverts that to say people are born good and it's society that makes them bad, and evil ultimately comes from society. So like you have, for example, Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. And one of the things he says, he wrote that dumb children's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist for Babies or whatever. And he puts it there very simply. He says, it's not people that are bad, it's policies that are bad. Now, the Catholic Church has actually spoken about this. I wrote a book recently called Confusion in the Kingdom. And in there, I quote Pope St. John Paul II, who said that while structures of sin do exist, like if you have laws that say, white people can enslave black people, that's an evil law. But he says that among some non-Christians, they try to isolate sin into structures only. And that sin only exists in these kinds of structures. And that's what we need to change, not the person. When ultimately these sinful structures exist because of the sins that reside in man's heart. And that's why man's heart needs God to be freed from sin.
One of the ways that this manifests is in places like international institutions. I was speaking earlier today about the sort of take from Barack Obama. There's a quote from Dreams from My Father, which I pointed this out at the time in 2008 when the book started to become really popular, that this is a perverse view of humanity. He said, quote, I have seen the desperation and disorder of the powerless, how it twists the lives of children on the streets of Jakarta or Nairobi in much the same ways it does the lives of children on Chicago's South Side, how narrow the path is for them between humiliation and untrammeled fury, how easily they slip into violence and despair. I know that the response of the powerful to this disorder, alternating as it does between a dull complacency and, when the disorder spills out of its proscribed confines, a study, unthinking application of force, of longer prison sentences, and more sophisticated military hardware is inadequate to the task. I know the hardening of lines, the embrace of fundamentalism and tribe dooms us all. So in other words, all human sin, violence, terrorism, it's all springing from a system that is socially unjust. And if we just change the systems, then magically everybody will turn into a good citizen. We all basically agree that terrorists who are bombing train stations in Jerusalem are exactly the same, even as gang members in Chicago who are exactly the same as people who are law-abiding citizens in Chicago. It's all of this sort of flattening of society into all the problems are society's problems. Therefore, if we just switch the systems, that's a deeply tyrannical view of how society ought to work.
It's also inconsistent if you think about it, Ben, because these people will say, oh, well, what makes you immoral? Why there's crime in certain areas? Why certain people from lower socioeconomic status commit crimes? It's just because that you don't have opportunity, you don't have resources, you don't have education, you don't have income. If we provided for their material, if their material needs were provided for, you wouldn't have crime, you wouldn't have this dysfunction. Yet these same people will say that affluent whites who have privilege, who have income, who have everything you want, they will constantly morally berate them as being racist, as being corrupt, as being oppressing people. So what's interesting there is that they'll say that certain people who have privilege, who have money, they're still really bad in spite of all of that. Oh, well, then what is it that makes them bad, even though they have every material thing they should want in this life? So there's also a bit of an inconsistency there. But you're right, it's very degrading because, look, there are virtuous poor people and there are vicious poor people. There are virtuous rich people and there are vicious rich people. And that's why the gospel is proclaimed to everyone, because sin is not just a product of socioeconomic circumstances. It's something deep within the human condition that we need our Lord and Savior to eradicate.
Well, that is Trent Horn, apologist for Catholic Answers, host of the Council of Trent podcast, which is always worth the listen. Trent, really appreciate the time and the insight.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
Thank you guys so much for watching. Just a heads up, today was kind of a bonus early release episode. I'll be taking the next 2 weeks off as we keep working on building the new studio. But thank you all so much for your support, and I hope you have a very blessed day.